and revenue. It appears that apparently independent, or at least separate, news organisations are collaborating, and I hesitate to use this word, conspiring to control global news narratives in some of the most important stories in the world. Why? Well, let's explain to you that their intention, it appears, and this is explicit, and we have a quote that undergirds this claim, the explicit intention is to shut down independent media voices. The lawsuit notes that there are two categories of TNI members: legacy news organisations and big tech platforms. You will remember that there was a time where on certain platforms, for example YouTube, where we are now significantly demonetized, you used to have the sense that independent news organisations could flourish, could burgeon, could come up, could establish an audience precisely because they would report in a different way to the mainstream news media. Over time, it's become clear that whether it's on the left or the right, when it comes to significant issues, mainstream media and legacy media organisations report in the same way. I'm talking, for example, about the pandemic or about war, important defining issues. Initially, there was a point where online platforms housed independent media in a favourable way, but something appeared to change. It appears that big tech platforms and legacy media started to operate in alignment with one another. Well, why would that be? And is there any paper trail for how that happened and why that would happen? The TNI exists to, in its own words, choke off and stamp out online news reporting that the Trusted News Initiative or any of its members peremptorily deems misinformation, the lawsuit states. Choke off and stamp out independent news voices. Let me know what you think in the comments. TNI members have targeted and suppressed completely accurate online reporting by non-mainstream news publishers concerning both COVID-19 on matters including treatments, immunity, lab leak, vax injury, and lockdowns and lockdown mandates, and US elections, such as the Hunter Biden laptop story. It adds, by their own admission, members of the TNI have agreed to work together and have in fact worked together to exclude from the world's dominant internet platforms rival news publishers who engage in reporting that challenges and competes with TNI members, reporting on certain issues relating to COVID-19 and US politics. My objectivity has been strongly challenged over recent weeks, but I recognise that I am an insignificant individual in the scheme of things. What is incredibly important is independent media. What is incredibly important is the ability to hold the establishment to account. What is incredibly important is that you have independent media that doesn't just accept government narratives, but investigates, challenges mainstream legacy media narratives and government narratives. For example, a group like the Grey Zone. It doesn't even matter where politically they might lie, on the left or the right. This is becoming increasingly irrelevant because what we're seeing is the rise of centralization and authoritarianism, a desire to censor, to surveil, to control, to shut down dissent, and to deprive people of the option of meaningful political alternatives. What we are being given is a homogenized media space that literally has an accord to agree with one another and to defy, shut down, oppress, choke out, stamp on independent media voices. Why is that? Well, one might imagine is because they are in absolute alignment with centralist state and globalist elite dictates, and they simply don't want opposing voices out there. Because if there are opposing voices out there, then we have an alternative. We have an alternative view. We have the ability to oppose their agenda. Once independent voices are stamped out, then all you have are legacy media outlets who already agree with one another and already agree with the corporatist state. That means there will be no opposition. There will be no dissent. While the Trusted News Initiative publicly purports to be a self-appointed truth police, and that's not really the way to appoint police, is it? Who should be the police? Me? Extirpating online misinformation, in fact, it has suppressed wholly accurate and legitimate reporting in furtherance of the economic self-interest of its members. Economic self-interest of its members. Closing down truthful conversation, legitimate data in order to pursue economic interests. I believe it goes beyond even economic interests. I believe this is about ideology and the ability to oppose ideology. I believe this is about freedom. I believe this is about real democracy. Because for there to be real democracy, there has to be dissent. There has to be open communication. There has to be the ability to challenge mainstream media narratives. You can't have a media that is in lockstep with itself, immersively attacking on subjects like the war, COVID-19 and how to handle it, and a host of other issues. Here we have the evidence that the mainstream media is working together to support a state agenda. Do you agree? Let me know. To support the allegation, the lawsuit cites several public statements made by TNI members. In March 2020, then senior news controller at BBC News, Jamie Angus, explained TNI centralized strategy to beat disinformation. Now remember, we've said for a long time, disinformation is an extraordinary new term. Disinformation, misinformation, malinformation. What is meant? Often it's information that is at odds with the agenda of the powerful. So here's that quote. Because actually the real rivalry now is not between, for example, the BBC and CNN globally. It's actually between all trusted news providers, trusted means members of this cartel, trusted news providers, and a tidal wave of unchecked reporting, uncensored reporting, that's being piped out mainly through digital platforms, independent media like this. That's the real competition now in the digital media world. Of course, organisations will always compete against one another for audiences, but the existential threat, I think, is that overall breakdown in trust, so that trusted news organisations lose in the long term if audiences just abandon the idea of a relationship of trust with news organisations. And what is happening with trust in mainstream media organisations? Well, nearly 60% of people see mainstream media as a threat to democracy, according to one poll. The UK's got the second lowest levels of trust in the press in a survey of 24 countries, only Egypt having less trust. America's trust in media remains at a new record low, and trust in media is so low that half of Americans now believe that news organisations deliberately mislead them. So if you're in America, you're already accustomed to the idea that the mainstream media deliberately misleads you. Why? Because they want to destroy independent media, because they are in alliance with centralist state and corporatist imperatives, and because they do not want dissenting and opposing voices. And remember, we showed you earlier, when it comes to the intelligence and psyops component of this, it doesn't matter whether you're a foreign combatant in the Middle East, specifically ISIS, or someone that has questions about COVID-19. You are regarded as an enemy of the centralist state and corporate media narrative, and you have to be shut down. The spokesman for the Trusted News Initiative continued. So actually, we've got a lot more to hold us together than we have to work in competition with one another. Plaintiffs are online news publishers who, as a result of the TNI's group boycott, have been censored, demonetized, demoted, throttled, shadow banned, and or excluded entirely from platforms like Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and Instagram. Explaining how TNI acts as a global media monopoly, CHD President Mary Holland said, "They couch what they're doing, their conspiracy to suppress independent media, i.e. the voices of dissent about election information and COVID information, as a need to preserve the trust of the people and upgrade the trust. By censoring independent voices, what they're doing is economic suppression. Antitrust is against trusts, is against monopolies, and what the TNI has done is essentially create a global media monopoly in the English language." Plainly, this is a story that is much bigger than me. Plainly, the Trusted News Initiative has an agenda, an explicit agenda to throttle and choke independent media. Plainly, the government are reaching out to ask big tech platforms to suppress the voices of content creators from independent media outlets, particularly those that are dissenting. And as you have seen, many of those media organisations have been willing to comply. It seems to me highly possible and likely that legacy media organisations and big tech platforms are collaborating in a variety of ways. Look at the reporting on geopolitical conflicts. Look at the ability of the military-industrial complex to apparently control those narratives and shut down dissent and direct public funds. Look at what happened in the pandemic period and how difficult it was to have true information and legitimate experts able to present their views. Plainly, there is something happening. We can see the legislation for it in all of the Five Eyes countries. We can see that the Trusted News Initiative is a cartel of groups with a clear agenda. They're not competing with one another. They are competing with independent media voices. And that's not because the independent media voices themselves are important. There are thousands of them. That's what is significant. That is what is powerful. What is truly important is the ability for dissent, your dissent, to be expressed. The ability for those of us that disagree with this system, that disagree with centralized authoritarianism, to have the ability to communicate with one another, to have the ability to discuss these topics, to have the ability to oppose an agenda that seems to me to be about closing down individual freedom, closing down democracy, centralizing power, destroying dissent, advancing surveillance and censorship. No matter what crisis, the outcome is always the same. We have to shut down dissenting voices. And when you have PSYOP organizations that treat people that have questions about a health issue the same way that they would treat terrorists, then I think it's time to look at the way that information is being reported and the way that information is being conveyed. Stay free.
Thank you for choosing Fox News.